Hello and welcome to the 12th episode of Watchtower in Focus, the show that zooms in on all things JW, bringing the governing body and its teachings and policies under microscopic scrutiny. In this episode, we will be discussing an article that has appeared in the Philadelphia Inquirer over the weekend. Penned by David Gambacorta, Silent Witnesses is a brilliant piece that elegantly summarises some key stories that serve to highlight Watchtower's mishandling of child sexual abuse. One of those stories involves our guest today, but before I introduce him, allow me to introduce my regular co-hosts from JW Survey, Covert Fade and John Redwood.
Hello everyone.
Greetings.
Hello, Covert and John. Well, it's an absolute thrill to have on the show Martin Haugh, who was actually mentioned. Actually, his story features very early on in the Silent Witnesses article, and it's both compelling and tragic. Martin, thanks so much for coming on Watchtower in Focus to talk further about your story.
You're welcome. This is quite a privilege.
Brilliant. So, wow. What to say? We were hoping to get David Gambacorta on the show to talk about his piece. I think because I've seen quite a few newspaper articles and media reports about Jehovah's Witnesses in my 7 years of activism. And David's article I've told him, is right up there in terms of the lengths he went to get the story right. I mean, factually, it's spot on. He covers so much ground in giving depth to the story. And again, Martin, your story really kind of brings home the reality and the human cost behind Watchtower's negligence in this area. Were you pleased with how Martin approached this topic? With how David approached this topic?
Yeah, he did a great job. Many of you might know he put a comment on the Reddit, the XJW Reddit, a few months ago, asking for stories. Well, my wife reached out to him first, and then he wanted to talk to me. So he spent many times interviewing us. He actually went to our Kingdom Hall and Red Line, where we used to go to. As you saw in the article, he went to Warwick, so he spent a lot of time research. He did an excellent job. There's just a few little minor things, but I think he spot on nailed everything.
I believe so. I think, John, you checked the article, you fact-checked it and could only find one thing that was slightly askew. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. There was actually just one very, very minor issue, and Dave went in and corrected it right away, and it didn't affect the article one bit. So he did a tremendous amount of vetting, and I think the article mentions he interviewed at least 14 different people. I was one of the people that he interviewed, but he obviously did a tremendous job in fact checking even the history of the organization. If our viewers have had a chance to read the article, not only did he go to Warwick, but he actually went into the history of the organization, mentioning little things like Charles Russell had lived in Philadelphia for a short period of time. Which was interesting to the readers since it's a Philadelphia newspaper. So it was quite well done.
Indeed.
Yeah, the thing that really impressed me about this was, well, the many things. It reminded me of the way that Angus Stewart, during the Royal Commission in 2015 in Australia, he'd never been a witness, but he was able to very quickly come to grasps with what's actually quite a confusing and complex religion with a very kind of intricate culture. It was a similar thing with David. He managed to obviously he's never been a witness, but you see from his article, he's really gone in depth with his research, and he's taken the time to become very familiar with what could be a potentially very confusing religion in terms of its history and the culture and the way that people's emotions are played with and the way that witnesses feel that they're under, compulsion to act a certain way. So it put me in mind. Just one of the things that occurred to me, it put me in mind of the way that Angus was able to immerse himself in the witness world. You can see that the same thing was done here in the way this article was written.
Indeed, it was really. You touched on It's been touched on the historical kind of summary that was given. I just find it so enriching to read Watchtower history from an objective or critical perspective, because it's so different from what we're used to when we're Jehovah's Witnesses. We're used to this highly polished version of the organisation's history, and to read a kind of no holds barred account that just tells it like it is, I always find that enriching. Martin, obviously I don't want to kind of rake over your story too much, because I can imagine it will be, unsettling for you. Suffice to say, it's in the article, and I would encourage viewers to read it. What was it like? What's it like for you to see your story receive that kind of exposure? Do you feel it kind of has any kind of cathartic value?
Oh, it feels amazing, because for 2 years I've been trying to get this story out. I've talked to several different reporters. Actually, the local paper here, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, the reporter actually wrote the article, but he did not want to publish it until they arrested the perpetrator. They have a warrant out for his arrest right now, but they cannot find him. So his editor wouldn't let him run the story. So I've been working with different reporters for 2 years trying to get this story out, because for so many years, when I was still indoctrinated, I kept it hidden. I didn't talk to anybody about it, not even my family. So I want as many people to know about it. But not only is it my daughter's story, but it's so many other people that I know of who have been affected by the same situation.
If I can just summarize what happened without going into too much detail, your daughter at the age of 4 was molested actually inside the Kingdom Hall.
Yeah, but the article is actually tones it down, because it wasn't just once. It happened more than once.
Right.
And so it was the first time I thought maybe I was overreacting, and the elders botched the whole thing. I was serving as a ministerial servant at the time, but yes, it happened at the Kingdom Hall all 3 different times.
And if you could summarize, because this is one major issue that we have when we're dealing with the whole issue of child sex abuse and Jehovah's Witnesses. One of the issues that we have in dealing with this is that you often will get witnesses come back and say, oh, well, you're just picking on a small number of cases where elders haven't done things properly. But when stories like yours come to light, and it's story after story after story after story, you come to realise that actually there's a pattern here, and actually the policies in some ways are even better than what actually ends up happening in practice with the elders. Would that be fair?
Yes, because again, going not too much into the story, but the perpetrator in my daughter's case had actually abused a girl in the congregation before he moved to our congregation. Now, at the time, I was not an elder, but the elders knew about it. They could have warned the congregation. They could have protected us. And there were 16 active elders in that congregation at that time. So if 16 men can't protect one child, how can a congregation with 4 or 3 or 2 elders protect children? So it just shows you that these policies are very lacking.
Indeed. Go on, Covert.
I was just going to say, and that actually directly addresses one thing that sometimes you will hear Watchtower or those who want to defend Watchtower say, well, it's okay because if there's a known molester, the elders keep an eye on them and they make sure nothing happens. And that's the defense they sometimes give. Well, as your case clearly shows, the elders knowing of it didn't stop a reoccurrence of offense. It didn't stop that predator attacking another person, because the reality is that the elders are not able to watch somebody 24/7. They're not equipped to carry out surveillance on a dangerous predator. And so that defense, which we sometimes hear from Watchtower put forward, for example, in the Royal Commission, or you sometimes hear from Jehovah's Witnesses who are trying to kind of justify the way Watchtower acts, time and again, as we see here, Martin, in your case tragically, but in so many others as well, the elders being aware of a predator and trying to watch that predator doesn't stop that predator offending again and again. And that's something I think it's vital that for Watchtower to realize, is that it's demanding that elders do something they simply can't do.
And all three of these incidents happened at meetings for field service. So they weren't the Sunday meeting or the Tuesday night meeting. These were meetings for field service. So again, in most congregations, the elders aren't out as much as the regular pioneers, the sisters are. So in these cases, there were no elders at the Kingdom Hall. But again, I was a servant. I could have been told, but I was not warned about this situation.
I think one of the most disturbing elements is, just focusing again on what I was saying earlier about that the policies are one thing, but the way the elders actually react in practice is another. And just to actually read an account of where elders are actually threatening you as a parent who has gone through this nightmare scenario, and as a father, it's just, I don't even want to think about it. It's just that awful. But to go through that scenario and then be threatened, if you go and speak to the police, there will be consequences. That is not the sort of thing that you see in the policies. That's not the sort of thing you see Anthony Morris confessing to when he dealt with the whole issue on his JW Broadcasting episode. I forget which year it was. But yet that's the reality on the ground, that people have been told that by elders time and time again.
And I was disciplined by the elders because I was a ministerial servant at the time. And after the first two instances, I went to the elders, and they didn't believe me. They thought I was overreacting. There was even a sister who witnessed the second event. She saw it, but they didn't believe her either. There was actually two witnesses. So they didn't even call the branch after the second time. So 6 months later, it happened again, and I wasn't present there the third time, but my wife was. I was actually out in service till 3 o'clock that day. And my wife dropped me off to go to sleep, so I worked third shift. And then within 15 minutes, she was back at the house here when they had a meeting for field service at 3. That's when he grabbed her for the third time. That's when I called the branch. So I actually was so angry after the third time that I called the branch as a ministerial servant. So that was Wednesday in April of 2006. And the next Sunday, I had an elders meeting, and they said I broke their procedure, the rules. And because of that, I was not allowed to give talks or have any other privileges for 6 months. So they didn't delete me as a servant, but they did punish me not because I did anything wrong. It's because I broke their rules.
Good grief.
Martin, can you tell us a little bit about how that call went down? Did you pick up the phone and call Brooklyn at that time, or did you call Patterson and speak to the service department?
Yeah, because again, not to name drop, but I have aunt and uncles. My uncle is a director of the corporation. My sister's been at Brooklyn Bethel. Well, she's at Warwick now, but she's been at Bethel for 20 years. My dad served, my uncle served. So I knew a lot of Bethelites. In fact, Ralph Walls was my dad's roommate on the branch committee, so I have known him my whole life. So I knew to call the service department. I knew who to call, which is a sad thing to say. So I actually talked to somebody. He was very nice. He was very reassuring. Of course, he lied to me and said this doesn't happen very often. It's very few. And he said they will take care of it. They're sorry. But again, it's so hard to describe the amount of anger, the amount of rage I had. I wanted to buy a gun that day and use it, but luckily I didn't do that.
So Martin, did he turn you in? Did he contact your local elders?
Oh, yes. Yep. They knew right away on Sunday that before, I don't know when he did it, but this was a Wednesday. On Sunday after the meeting, I had about an hour-long meeting with two elders.
And the nature of the meeting was, why did you contact Bethel behind our backs?
Yes, exactly. Then I said, well, why didn't you call the branch last time? And they said, we didn't have enough to go on. Maybe you were overreacting.
Which is a violation of their own guidelines, because even by Watchtower's flawed process, two separate people saying, I have observed individual X abusing a child, is enough evidence for the branch to be contacted. Yeah. So that's just disgusting.
Yeah. The second time, again, I'm just going to briefly talk about it. The second time, it was a meeting for field service, and none of the others were there. I actually conducted in this. My son wasn't potty trained yet, so my wife was changing him in the bathroom, and I was giving out service assignments for territories for the sisters, and my daughter disappeared. So I was actually engaged in helping other people, and I couldn't find her. This was the Sunday after the first Wednesday incident, and in the elders' room, the door was locked, and I couldn't get in there. But this elders' room had two doors. There was a side door by the literature counter. He forgot to lock that door, and that's how I got in there. But the sister who was with me in our service group that morning, she walked in the room with me, and she saw him do what he was doing to my.
This seems like a really twisted, brazen individual to just keep going at it again and again and again. And he's able to do all this in a Kingdom Hall setting with the elders apparently completely indifferent to what's going on. That's the picture you're painting.
Yes. And again, this same perpetrator, this same creep, after he moved out of Red Line, Pennsylvania, they moved to Delaware. And I was an elder at this time. This is many years later, and we had an emergency elders meeting. At this time, we had 18 elders in the congregation. We all got together and said, he has done it again in Delaware, and the Watchtower wants all the records we have of these cases sent to the Delaware brothers. So again, before he came to our congregation, at my congregation, and it happened again after he left our congregation, the same person.
And how does that make you feel as a parent of one of his victims?
Okay. It's different now than it was in like 2011, 2012 when I found out about the third time. At that time, I thought, well, finally, these people believe me. Because, again, I was considered the bad person. I was bringing reproach upon Jehovah's name. That's what they actually said by making a big deal about it. But now the elders actually believe me that this guy – at the time, I still was a believer. I still was brainwashed. I still thought, okay, we got him. Jehovah's justice will be upon this person. But now, totally different. I just wish I would have woken up in 2005 and not 2016. But what are you going to do? I mean,
so for all of those years, you assumed that justice of a sort had been administered.
Yeah, I thought that, the truth would come out. I would be vindicated. Jehovah's name would be clean. But that, that.
But meanwhile, he's still in the community,
yes,
and free to abuse whoever he wants, whether it's a Jehovah's Witness or a child of non-JW parents. Again, quite horrifying. And another horrifying part of the article was where I think it was your wife who mentioned that they knew of others in your old congregation, that more pedophiles.
Yes, yeah. Red Line is. For some reason, I don't know why, a history with this. I went to that congregation back in the 80s as a little kid, and I moved back there in 1999. And within weeks of me moving there in 99, we learned of another case with a woman abusing a young boy. And even though nobody was supposed to know about it, I was a regular pioneer out in service every day, regular pioneers gossip. So I learned about that case. So I was still a servant back in 99. That was the first case in Red Line. My case was 2005, but there were still 3 more to come when I was still a servant and later became an elder.
Those stats you quote, it's actually quite sobering, because I know when they did the in the Australian Royal Commission, the Commission was able to obtain a statistical breakdown of the number of offenders since 1950. And I remember when we worked out the statistics, it meant that most congregations in Australia had an abuser in them since 1950, and some of them would have had at least 2.
Yeah, so we had 5 in Red Line. Yeah.
Which just goes to show, which is like the more we're finding out that those stats in Australia are not just a statistical aberration. In fact, if anything, I mean, you've got 5 in one congregation. So that's, and for all we know, that's not a statistical aberration either. That could be disturbingly common. So when we're zooming in, like when the organization tries to say it's a very rare problem that we have, it's not a problem that we have very often. The further we're digging, we're finding out it's disturbingly common. It actually is really worrying. I mean, from the look of this, the odds are if you go into a congregation in Australia or America, the odds are fairly high that someone, either there is an abuser, or at some point in the last 50 years, there has been an abuser in that congregation.
John,
Martin.
Sorry, John. I was just going to ask. You're not in Pennsylvania, but you don't live all that far away.
Right.
Feel free to ask Martin whatever you like, and Martin, you can jump in on this as well. But I just want to. I know that there's a lot going on in your kind of area with regard to JW pedophiles, media, and court cases. John, I'm wondering if you can just kind of sum up what you know about what's happening in your area. And Martin, again, feel free to chip in if there's anything you'd like to add.
Yeah, I think it's great that Martin has gotten involved. In fact, we had a private discussion a while back in which he mentioned to me that his first connection to this child abuse problem, aside from his own experience, was the revelation that there was another court case, which was Fessler versus Watchtower, that happened last year in February of 2017. And it was interesting. I think, Martin, you said that you were actually preparing for the Super Bowl, and I think you stopped at a car wash and you just happened to look at your phone and you saw this JW Survey article on February 3rd, which was the Fessler trial, and that immediately gave you the information and the impetus to contact the law firm that was suing Watchtower. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about how that happened, how you read the article, and what happened next.
Well, it was a beautiful February day. It was probably like 70 degrees. I wanted to wash the car. I took the whole week off of work just to relax. I had no convention to go to, no unassigned territory. I can just take a week off and relax. And there was a lot of people at the car wash. So I was just waiting for my time. I saw the article, and I think this was a Friday. I saw the article before the Super Bowl,
right?
And I immediately contacted the lawyer because what struck me as crazy was Stephanie Fessler went to the Spring Grove congregation, which bordered the Red Line congregation, so just to the west of it. I've given talks in that congregation, public talks. It's a 15, 20-minute drive.
So we're now talking two congregations that border each other, both with a pedophile problem. Wow.
And then there'll be don't worry, we'll get to York-Anna. York-Anna is the congregation to the east of us.
Wow.
And they have,
oh my word.
Good grief.
And Freeland, Maryland.
Like a network.
Yes. So I don't know what's wrong with South Central Pennsylvania, but it's a pedophile hotbed for some reason. So now,
or might not be. It might be standard. We have no way of knowing.
Yeah, we don't know. But what struck me as crazy was the fact that we have the same circuit overseer, Freeland, Maryland, York-Anna, Spring Grove, and Red Line, all share the same circuit overseer. So when the second incident, the first two incidents happened October 2005, I was trying to do the right thing. I didn't go to the circuit overseer, but the parents of the person who abused my daughter, they did. So the circuit overseer, in November or December, like a month after, he had a little pep talk with my wife and I saying, don't worry about it. These things never happen. I've been a circuit overseer for like 20 years, and this is like the first or second time I've ever happened with these cases. So, just stay loyal to Jehovah. Everything will work out. And at the time, it was a very encouraging, very nice, loving talk. But then I found out later on that it was a pack of lies because Stephanie the elders found out about it in October of 2005, the exact same month as my daughter was abused. So the circuit overseer knew about my case and Stephanie's case, and he lied right to my face because they were going on at the same exact time.
Martin, why did the abuser's parents go to the circuit overseer?
I'm going to say two words: nut jobs. They were totally crazy, especially the wife. Now, his father got deleted as an elder, and he came to our congregation, and I just assumed he did something wrong. But then maybe later on, I figured out why he got deleted as an elder, and it was a little bit of a lot of things actually, but it was his arrogant attitude, like he thought he was always right, and so he wanted the justification from the circuit overseer saying that my son didn't do this. So he was furious. He decided to leave his congregation in York-Anna and come to Red Line. And so they went to the elders, the circuit overseer, trying to get justification to punish me more. And his son at the time of the abuse was 16 and my daughter was 4. So he still was a minor, but he was old enough to know what's right and what's wrong.
So, Martin, you actually, when you contacted Jeffrey Fritz, the attorney in the Fessler case, you ended up receiving a subpoena, which we can talk about. And of course, you ended up not testifying because Watchtower settled that case after the 4th day of the trial. But one of the interesting things that came out in that case was they deposed and interviewed a witness on the stand by the name of Donald Hollingworth. And on the stand, he mentioned that there was a practice of shredding files within those congregations. And so we have one elder admitting to shredding files, but you told me that I believe it was the Sarah Brooks case, which is another victim mentioned in the Philadelphia Inquirer article, that you were a witness to the shredding of files and even the purchasing of a shredder. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Okay, so we're jumping a little forward in history now. We're about 2012. Sarah Brooks was in York Anna. So if anybody wants to put this in your mind, York Anna's to the east, Red Line's more in the center, Spring Grove's to the west. The abuse happened in York Anna, but she decided to move out of York Anna into Red Line, and she was there only a few months. And then she didn't go to me, but she went to another elder about these abuse over these years. So immediately we had to have a committee formed. So at this time, we had 18 elders. We had a meeting, and the coordinator said we have to assign a couple elders to investigate this. But again, all the details that those two elders learned from her, they discussed it in front of the rest of the body, all the details. Now, they encouraged her not to go to the police, but she did not listen to their counsel, and she actually did. So then we had a meeting within a week later saying we have two detectives, York County Police detectives, coming to our Red Line and Kingdom Hall, and they're going to take all the records they have on Sarah Brooks. So the coordinator was instructed from the branch to shred any personal notes that those two elders who had met with her had taken before the police got there.
That's surely illegal to do that.
But again, Lloyd, the way they handle judicial committees is that the chairman takes all the notes the other two elders have and he destroys them after he types them up for his own note. But the crazy thing is, now, this Kingdom Hall was about 60, 70 years old. I mean, the congregation, it's an old congregation. So we had judicial committee records going back 50, 60 years. From the 60s, there were still envelopes in there. The branch was concerned that those police would take all the records. So they were more concerned with them taking like other disfellowshipping for anything, drunkenness, immorality. So they wanted to make sure they only took the file that had Sarah Brooks' name on it. So they asked me, because I worked night shift at the time, to be there to make sure those police officers did not take anything more than they were allowed to, because they were really concerned that all these records from 30, 40 years of disfellowshipping cases would have been opened up by the police and gone through.
So they shredded all of them?
No, they just shredded her notes. Everything for her,
just
they
her
shredded.
Notes. But
yeah,
I can't get my head around this. This is criminal evidence, and they're shredding it. There's no those notes don't exist in any other form. Once they're shredded, they're gone.
But the way the letter that our coordinator read to us, because I didn't get the letter, he just read it to us. It said those personal notes that the elders take are just their own personal words. It doesn't belong to the congregation. So that's why they should be destroyed.
So they're they're destroying it, but they're trying to justify it in a way with the wording so that it doesn't come off quite as serious as it is.
So when it suits the organization, the elders are beholden to Watchtower and work for the congregation. But when it doesn't suit them, the elders are now these total strangers who are vaguely connected with the congregation and whose notes can be shredded. Absolutely astonishing.
And it's interesting because the more we hear these accounts of instances where this destruction has happened in the past, it really does justify the concerns that exist right now. For example, we've been following the organization Reclaimed Voices in the Netherlands. And one of the things they're trying to do is get Watchtower to hand over to victims, to past JW survivors of child sex abuse, the notes that Watchtower has on them. And one of the concerns that Reclaimed Voices has flagged to the government is we're worried that Watchtower will destroy this rather than hand it over. And you sometimes hear Watchtower hand wave, or Jehovah's Witnesses might say, oh, they'd never do that. But again, if you want to look at what someone will do in the future, well, look at their track record. What's Watchtower's track record on this? And and you're relating to us now, Martin, you've got direct experience of the branch finding out that the police were coming for evidence in a case of JW child abuse, and the command from the branch was, burn it all down.
I think Martin, you are actually the clearest kind of first-hand witness to this practice, because I've kind of known about it, but you're the first person I've spoken to who, yes, that's totally what we did.
I have a little funny story what Covert said about burning it down, because this same Kingdom Hall might be cursed, because in 2007 that Kingdom Hall burned to the ground by a fire, and the elders were worried that all the records would be destroyed. And so they said it was Holy Spirit that would survive, but it was because they were in a fireproof cabinet. That's why they survived from that Kingdom Hall. They did rebuild the same hall at the same spot, but yes.
Yeah. Oh no.
Just incredible. Right,
Why did it burn down?
You don't want to know. It was RBC faulty electrical work. So
Okay.
you have a teenager wiring cables. So.
Yeah, it was
I'm
typical Watchtower attention to health and safety, probably.
I've seen a number of RBC builds. I find that very easy to believe. Yeah.
While we digest all this, because I'm quite frankly flummoxed and gobsmacked by what Martin's just been telling us, perhaps now would be a good point to do the news piece, and then we will return and just give our summary thoughts on what we've just heard. So it is now time, ladies and gentlemen, for Covert Fade introduces the news.
And thank you, Lloyd. Okay, so I've got 3 news articles to go through this week. The first 2 are kind of on a theme of what we've been discussing, and then the last one's a little bit different. So I'll save that one for a bit of a change of pace at the end. So the first one is continuing the theme of Jehovah's Witnesses and the ongoing child sex abuse crisis. There's actually been another article which was run recently, and this one's about abuse in Norway. It's available. It's called The Elder. It's actually available in English now. Originally, it was in Norwegian only. Or it might have been Finnish. I'm sorry, my notes are a bit blurred. But it was a very similar piece of investigative journalism.
It's Norwegian.
Norwegian, yeah. In that it tracked the efforts of the Jehovah's Witnesses to essentially not deal with an abuser who'd moved internationally, moved from Norway to Spain, and the abuse was discovered in Spain. I'm not going to go into too many details because it's really, John's holding up an example of the article there. There we go. So that's also available in English. If you go into Google and type, The Elder, Norway child sex abuse.
And we've got the Philadelphia Inquirer being held up there as well.
Exactly, which I was going to, when we come back, actually, Martin, I want to ask you about how it felt to see that on newsstands.
Yeah.
But that's an article that's really worth reading. It's very well researched. It tells a story that is different in the details, but very similar in terms of the general theme of what we're discussing, of Watchtower being completely incapable of dealing with this with their own policies, but also being absolutely terrified of involving the professionals in law enforcement. So that's one that's definitely worth tracking down. And also, it really does feel like there's been an absolute floodgate of these media articles opened in the past couple of years. So it's really heartening to see the media, waking up to the scale of this crisis. The second news article is on a similar theme, but this is Here We Go Again in a slightly different way. I'll read you the headline and then you'll see what I mean. Judge orders Jehovah's Witnesses to turn over internal documents related to childhood sex abuse. This is relating to a lawsuit which is being brought against Watchtower in the US by the legal firm Nix, Patterson and Roach. And it basically, on April the 5th, 2018, Judge James Manley of Sanders County, Montana, ordered the Jehovah's Witness religion to produce documents and testimony related to internal reports and investigations into the childhood sexual abuse of 2 of NPR, that's this legal firm's clients. What's happening essentially, this is a repeat of the Campos lawsuits in many ways. 2 people who were abused as Jehovah's Witnesses are suing the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society for negligence. As part of the demands, the law firm has put forward that the Jehovah's Witnesses need to turn over, documents they have that prove that the witnesses were aware of the abuse but didn't act on it properly. And the judge has agreed these documents must be produced, and now we're going to see what Watchtower is going to do. Now, the last time we were in a situation like this in the US, Watchtower point blank at first refused. Then they grudgingly provided some documents, but they were so heavily redacted that they were useless. If you want to, if anyone wants to like go through the whole story, you can check out JW's survey. We've kind of chronicled all the twists and turns of it. The end result was that Watchtower ended up getting fined $4,000 a day for not producing these documents, and in the end, Watchtower settled out of court. And if you read between the lines, they must have settled for a huge amount. We're talking millions. So I guess we're just going to have to see how this one plays out, whether or not Watchtower will settle, how quickly they will settle, or will they try and fight this to the bitter end?
But if the Campos case is any indication, that'll hold on to those records and won't share them no matter what the court asks them to do. Yeah.
So one thing I wanted to mention, Covert, with that is that I don't want to confuse the public into thinking that Watchtower is being subpoenaed for the same documents that the Campos and Padron cases were looking for, which was all child abuse documents from 1997 and forward. But in this case, they're seeking all documents that are specifically related to this case and any related documents. So it is a little bit different. They obviously are in a different district because this case is in Montana and not California. And so there's a different judge and a different dynamic in that case. But it is correct to say that they are seeking all documents. And another thing I'll point out is that last Monday, Watchtower's representative flew to Montana on Monday to be deposed by the attorneys for the Montana victims. And one thing interesting that happened was that the attorneys specifically asked the Watchtower and CCJW representative if they knew about the records management department. And we've talked about this a little bit recently in our last episode of Watchtower in Focus. And they said no. They didn't know what records management was, had no idea. So clearly...
At which point his pants spontaneously exploded into fire.
Indeed. Yeah. So it's going to be an interesting case to see how that develops, because I think the Watchtower attorneys, they don't realize how much information we have. And, for those that don't know this, often the attorneys, what they will do is they will ask Watchtower or anyone that they're deposing a question for which they already know the answer. And when they already know the answer, then the answer that's supplied is either going to be true or false, and they can judge it against the information they already have. So this is how we catch individuals in lies, by asking them questions that we already know the answer to. So when we ask them, is there a records management department? And they say no, we know that Watchtower is lying.
And this has already worked brilliantly in the case of the Fessler case, for which both John Redwood and you, Martin, were deposed, although I understand, Martin, you didn't get a chance to get your turn because it settled too soon. But nevertheless, lawyers who are going after Watchtower have this incredible resource at their disposal of former witnesses, increasingly well-educated former witnesses who are doing their research and finding out what's going on, and it's really good to see that.
Yeah. So I think just to finish this story off on two things. One, I think it's going to be, as you say, it's going to be fascinating to keep a close eye on this case to see how it unfolds. And two, Watchtower's legal department really should be on notice that they can't lie to courts anymore. There are too many former witnesses who are willing to testify and willing to assist legal teams.
Indeed.
They're not going to get away with it. Now, the last little news article, we're going to take a little bit of a different change of pace. Watchtower, this is actually quite exciting. JW.org has updated. If you were to go to jw.org and try and find any of the publications published before the year 2000, you might have struggled because they weren't there. Joy of joys, we now have a wonderful banquet of pre-2000 spiritual food, which has just been uploaded.
A banquet of well-oiled dishes.
Well-oiled dishes.
Of wine kept on the dregs.
Wine kept on the dregs. So 20, 30, 40-year-old dishes that are beyond rancid and just disgusting right now. But this is I'm actually quite excited by this, because now I don't know why. I've heard a number of theories as to why Watchtower have done this, because we always used to say it was very convenient that you could only go back as far as the year 2000, because that kept some of the more embarrassing, awkward, and whoops, we got that wrong stuff off the online database. And now that's changed. And trust me, this is something that we might go into in another time, but there's a lot of really embarrassing stuff up there now. And one example I was going to pull out was 1975. Now, last year, Watchtower released a video that was set in the year 1975, and it was their way of trying to say, oh, we never said anything would happen in 1975. That was just some fringe elements. That was some fringe Jehovah's Witnesses who came to wrong conclusions, but we never said anything that would draw people to that conclusion. Well, the great thing is now you can go and check on their very own online Watchtower library to see all the multiple articles which they put out, which absolutely did point towards something happening in 1975, and which any reasonable Jehovah's Witness would have taken as wink, wink, nudge, nudge, don't make any holiday plans for 1975.
Yeah.
In fact, it's actually a lot more blatant than that.
Yeah.
So I'm quite happy that they've done this. In all credit to them, fair play to them. They're not hiding these articles anymore. And I hope they put the whole thing back up, because if we can get some of the Russell and the Rutherford craziness up there, everything from anti-aluminium to to your own you'll have your own
personal levitation devices,
to casual racism, to anti-Semitism, to all the really weird stuff.
The Ethiopian skin on Watchtower Library, that'd be interesting.
Yeah, women being changed to being men. You'll all become men again in the new system. That's a good one.
Yeah, I honestly had mixed feelings on this news. Mixed because I devote at least a page to this of Reluctant Apostate. And I criticise Watchtower for not putting the Revelation Climax book on its website. Now they've put the Revelation Climax book on their website, along with all these other publications. So I can't help, as an author, but feel a little bit miffed at having to go back and change this for future editions. I mean, obviously, with current editions, it was true when I wrote it, and I can't be held to account for it. But on the other hand, I think, well, hang on, we spend so much time criticising Watchtower, and it's justified criticism, especially when it comes to the nature of this particular episode. But when they do something right, we've got to acknowledge it and we've got to encourage it, because, what are they supposed to do? So it's good that we're seeing more transparency. Do I expect to see even more transparency, including with child abuse records being brought forward? No, I don't. But I can at least applaud them for what little bit of transparency they've given us. So that's kind of my take on it.
Yeah.
I think that what we're going to see is what they've done. It seems to me that they've taken the Watchtower CD-ROM library, which was available, used to be able to order at the literature counter, and they would send a disc. And of course, they're cutting costs, so they don't want to have to produce discs anymore. So now they essentially have the Watchtower CD-ROM library, which took the Watchtowers back to 1950 and the Awakes back to 1970, along with all the other printed publications, I think back to 1950. So it looks like that's what they're doing, is taking that CD-ROM information, transferring it over to the WOL, which is the Watchtower Online Library. So I would encourage our viewers to go and type some keywords. I did a few last night, like blood transfusions, and you'll see all of these articles which show the dangers of blood transfusions, particularly in the 60s and 70s. They created a tremendous atmosphere of fear. Because you have the scriptural admonition, which they believe is don't take blood because it's scriptural. But then they create this fear cloud around blood transfusions, which is really what causes most witnesses to say, well, I'm going to obey the Bible because getting a blood transfusion could cause me to get the personality of the person whose blood I'm receiving, right? That was in the 1960s. And that blood is tainted. The blood banks are tainted. In the 80s, they said you're going to get AIDS. So Watchtower perpetrated all of these articles and saturated the witnesses with these to the point where they had an inordinate fear of a very life-saving, practical medical procedure that saves lives.
It makes sense. Sorry, go on.
Sorry, I can remember 20 years ago out in service with an old elder who was discussing another brother was getting a heart transplant, and he said he should be disfellowshipped for that because he's going to be a different person now. He's going to take on the personality. And I'm like 2021, at the time I'm pioneering, and I'm like, no, that's the figurative heart, not the literal heart. You're going to be the same person. It's just a muscle, because he hadn't updated his thinking. He was still set back in the 60s,
when this stuff was printed.
Yeah.
Right in the Watchtower.
So those are my stories, and that brings an end to Covert Fade Introduces the News.
Thank you very much indeed, Covert. Expertly done, and you only needed a little bit of help there from John Redwood in identifying the language of the newspaper. So thank you to both of you. Now, this wasn't planned, but it just turns out that Martin's wife, Jennifer, has returned while he's been on air with us, and we now have an opportunity to get Jennifer's input in what we were discussing earlier in relation to this horrific story of abuse. Jennifer, thanks for joining us.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me. You guys hear me?
So yes, we can hear you loud and clear. So what's your take on this whole newspaper article business? Are you pleased to see your story in print?
I think they did an excellent job reporting the story, and I couldn't have asked for a better way to have our story told and to be out to help as many people as possible.
Indeed. And am I right in saying, just off air, John was asking you before about how you came to help Martin with his awakening? Perhaps, John, you can pick up on that line of questioning.
Yeah, so it was really exciting meeting Martin last year in Philadelphia. And so in the course of our discussion, Martin, he said a few very interesting things. And one of them was that you were instrumental in him waking up, and you guys had some very, very animated discussions when you started realizing that the organization was not where you needed to be. So maybe tell us a little bit about how that went down, and the waking up process for yourself and for Martin, and how that ultimately turned out.
Sure. Well, I had pioneered for almost 20 years, and they'd given me a Bible study, someone who had requested a study on the jw.org website, and she made incredible progress. She became an unbaptized publisher in record time. And she was a single mom with 2 little kids. And it was just like, I had never had an experience like that before. And then one day, I went on her Bible study, and she showed me the UN NGO organization information with the Watchtower, and I was just stunned, because I had grown up on the Revelation book. I knew that there was no way that Watchtower could possibly be involved in something like the image of the wild beast. That just could not be true. So when I went to the UN site and saw the letter for myself, I was stunned. I showed it to Martin, and he kind of poo-pooed it, like, well, maybe there was a reason, maybe we should talk to them, but, it really doesn't matter. This is God's organization. But that's where I really started to do research, and everything just unraveled. I was even on Jehovah'sWitnesses.net, and I went back and read some of Cedar's comments from way back in the day.
Wow.
I mean,
We're going way back now.
Yes, really, really, really far back as I could go. I wanted all the information that I could have, because I had never really, I just accepted it, that this was the truth, right? I mean, they wouldn't lie to me, but it turned out that every rock I uncovered was lie after lie after lie after lie. And when I finally really gathered my courage and realized that I couldn't go on this way, the final straw was the ark. I could not listen to Jeffrey Jackson's testimony and go on. There just was no going on from there.
What was the Australian Royal Commission like for you as the parent of a child abuse victim?
So sickening. I can't even describe to you how disgusting it is.
Sorry if that's a difficult question.
These people really don't for Jeffrey Jackson to answer questions like this when he has no idea what it's like to be a parent, or to have something like this happen to your child, and to just blithely go on this is just a corporate policy that is there not to benefit the child or the parent, or no, it's just to protect the corporation. is so obvious when you watch the way they're talking about it that they really don't care about the victims. He didn't read the victims' testimony. They don't care about what happened to the victims and their families. They only care about fiefdom and how they can protect that. So it was sickening. So the first thing I did after that was I woke my kids up, and I did that by having them watch Jeffrey Jackson's testimony. And my son got baptized when he was away. Like he never believed. He just played along because this is what the family did, and that he was just going to do that. And I sat in on his questions because, he was only 12 or 13, and, especially the second set, it's all about sex, and the elders were puzzled about why I would want to be there. You're kidding, right? I mean, I know what you're going to ask. So, and I sat there and listened to him give these, very thorough answers, and knowing the whole time that he didn't believe any of it. So he was easy. And then for our daughter, it was a little bit harder because, what we've gone through, what we put her through was because it was like in the furtherance of an ideal. And when you realize the ideal is a complete lie, that's devastating. Yeah. It's devastating. And it was harder for her to give up because
she would have had to put a lot of trust as well in this organization and in the so-called divinely instituted process for dealing with judicial cases. And all of a sudden she's finding out, no, that wasn't worthy of our trust.
Absolutely. And, her closest family members, my sister-in-law and her husband are at Walk Hill Bethel. She stayed at Walk Hill Bethel a number of times as a guest. So to know that, in leaving this, she's going to be losing close family relationships and people that she really cares about, it's a serious loss. And, all of her grandparents, all of it, all in one day.
I was going to ask actually, Jennifer, because I know I don't want to sort of drag you over the coals too much over the contents, because I know it's difficult to talk about. But you said your in-laws held a wake for you in the article. Did they literally do that? They held a wake to say goodbye when you guys left?
Okay, so this was reported back to us that they had essentially gathered the family together for a weekend, and they all drank and told stories. It sounded like that.
Was there catering? Were there flowers? That's what I want to know.
So, I don't want to get too mean, but I think the alcohol was probably the highlight.
Right. Well, it would have to be, wouldn't it? I guess.
Yeah. It's just so strange. And missionary family members participated in this. It's just so weird to me to think about. I never heard of anything like this before, but my in-laws are unusual.
So, Jennifer, so two questions for you that really jump out at me. Number one, what was it like for you to experience a Bible study who obviously went on the internet to find this information? She's studying with you. She put a request in through JW.org. You got it as a pioneer. You began studying with her. She makes progress. But number one, you realized your study was doing research on the internet. So that had to have a tremendous impact. And so I guess my question is, is that how it happened? And what are your feelings about, how obviously when we were kids, the internet really wasn't a thing. So as children, I'm not sure what year you were baptized. I was 1984. We had no internet, so I had no way of double checking what I was going through. So
did you have computers back then?
Oh. Yeah, I was baptized in 1988. I was 13 when I got baptized. So no, I mean, I was exposed to the internet fairly early. My dad ran a telecommunications company, so I was on Google before it was Google, and we still called it Mosaic. But no, we didn't. It was strongly discouraged to do any research. Just even Googling Jehovah's Witnesses is a bad idea. But when she showed me the research, and then I read the Guardian article, I'd always had this idea that if something is reported in, part of the media like The Guardian, if the Watchtower cites it, then it probably can be trusted as a source. And then to go back to the UN site itself and just to read the letter, that had a huge impact on me. And I didn't discount it because it was, an outside the prescribed, my husband did at first, because it was outside the line. But it was obvious to me that this is real. This really happens. And then, so I met with her. I tried to talk her down. And then after I'd done my own research, I basically told her how to hide, how to get away. Because she was a publisher. I didn't want anything. I'm like, you got to get out of here. Like, she was already planning on moving. Don't give your phone number to the elders. Change your number now so I don't have it. Basically cutting off all lines of communication so that there could be no action on the congregation's part. Now that I realize that the congregation that we attended is completely lazy and has no interest in any kind of actions.
Well, Jennifer, it's just a fascinating story because it reminds me of Carl Olaf Johnson, who was, I think, back in the late 1960s. He was studying the Bible with a man who asked him a question about 607 and said, I think that it's not 607 as the destruction of Jerusalem. And as we all know, that's pivotal to Watchtower theology.
Right.
And it was his Bible study who actually called him to do the research. And when he did the research, he said, I'm out of here. But of course, in his case, it took decades of research for him to end up finally being disfellowshipped by the organization. But your case reminds me strikingly of what Carl went through.
And I really appreciate it. I read all of his work. That was, for me, the pivotal thing with 607. Once that was knocked down for me, there was no going back. There was no pretending. It just couldn't. It couldn't be true. That was what he did. What he wrote was so important. And shout out to Wi-Fi Bandit for his timeline, because I made Martin look over that 4 times. Come on, prove it to me. Prove to me. Study with me, honey. Prove it to me that this is right. And I'll go back to being your little mindless pioneer wife, and we'll go back to that.
and there's a poetry to this as well, Jennifer, because it was sort of the media that prompted you to wake up through outsiders reading the media as well and getting to learn of what's on the internet and that kind of thing. And you are now in the media yourself, and your article will be read by outsiders who may get called on by Jehovah's Witnesses. So there's kind of poetry there, I think.
And, we've heard, too, from a few people that we've known from our witness past who have said that the article helped them. Some are still physically and mentally out, and others are completely out. That the article helped them to see,
Wow.
and I really appreciate hearing that, even if it's just one person who was genuinely helped. That's all I could ask.
Well, Jennifer, it's been a real treat to unexpectedly get you on our show.
Absolutely.
I'm going to ask you to hand over Martin again so that we can wrap up with him. But honestly, so thrilled with the exposure that you've received, and thank you so much for sharing your story.
Absolutely. Thank you. I have to find him.
Okay. We'll let you find him.
He's disappeared. I'll be back.
Okay.
Or he'll
Take
be
care,
back.
Jennifer. Bye.
So we now return to our interview with Martin. Martin, as we're wrapping things up here, I just can't help but repeat what I said earlier, that this is a fantastic piece of journalism. And that's coming from someone who's kind of kept his finger on the pulse when it comes to journalism over the past few years with regards to Jehovah's Witnesses. If you haven't read the article yet, please check it out. If you're on Twitter, just tweet David as well. He's on Twitter there, and just let him know. Give him your appreciation as well, because it's always nice when journalists receive appreciation. But Covert raised something interesting, Martin. I did touch on this with you earlier. What's it like to see the newspaper on the newsstands?
Well, yesterday was a special day because I dropped my daughter off at work, and I was on a mission to get as many copies as I could for prosperity's sake. And so I went to a local gas station. I had one copy, and I talked to the cashier, and I did some unwitnessing. So I spent about 2.5 hours. I got about 7 copies, and everywhere I went, I showed him my face and I said, "Hey, you should check this article out, please." So it was very fulfilling to see that finally this has been published, that over 1 million people hopefully will be able to read this article.
Indeed. And if there's any parents of abuse victims who have been in a similar situation to you, in other words, they've had no luck with their elders, and they're living in this kind of halfway state where they're assuming that their child's abuser has received justice because he's been reproved or he's been disfellowshipped, what would your advice be to them?
I would say do not hesitate. Go to the police. I would love to have a time machine, go back 13 years ago, and go to the police, but I was encouraged not to. Let them, they're professionals. You know, I served as an elder for 5 years. I'm a pressman. I run a printing press. I'm not qualified to investigate these things. There's elders who are dishwashers and window washers and janitors and plumbers. They're not qualified to investigate these things. So go to the authorities, go to the people who can handle these things, and that way they can prevent other children from being abused. And remember, you're not alone. This has happened not just in your little area. It's happening all over the United States, and it's happening all over the world. And these are not apostate lives. I am a 5th generation witness, not including overlapping generations. And yet I believed that this was the truth. And yet now they label me as an apostate, but for some reason they still haven't disfellowshipped me. Maybe after this video, I will finally be disfellowshipped, but we'll have to wait and see.
Well, we'll have to have you back on and find out what the ramifications are. But I can only express my gratitude on behalf of the whole team that you've chosen to come on and share your story, and thank you so much for doing that. John, do you have any kind of concluding thoughts to share? Again, I'm mindful of the fact that you are helping lawyers with cases in your area and have been doing that for a while now. So it's always great to hear your perspective as someone local too, Martin.
Yeah, well, it's been a real pleasure meeting Martin. I actually met him at the termination of the Fessler trial in Philadelphia. We had a chance to sit down and do an interview for more than 2 hours and, hear his story. And we shared each other's stories and stayed in contact since then. One thing I wanted to mention about the case or the Dave Gambacorta article from Philly.com, there's actually a second article, and perhaps we can post a link to it. But similar to what The Guardian is doing over in the UK, Dave Gambacorta from Philadelphia Inquirer has posted another article, and there's a link where you can go online. Anyone who is a victim or has a story to tell can email or send a message to the Philadelphia Inquirer, to the journalist, and of course it's private, and he'll discuss that with you. But please share your story. It doesn't have to be in Pennsylvania or Maryland. It can be anywhere in the world. In fact, I spoke yesterday to the journalist, and he said he's been getting absolutely overwhelmed with the response from all around the world, from Germany, from other parts of Europe. People are reading this article, so it's not just the 900 or 1 million people in Pennsylvania that are reading this Inquirer, but it's going global. So I encourage anyone who has a story to tell that, is at the point where they'd like to tell it, even if it's anonymous and they just want to share what they've been through, that helps tremendously. And I think, Martin, you can testify to the fact that when you learned about Fessler, I think you were motivated to come forward to tell your story, to explain what you know about what went on behind the scenes within the elders. We talked for a while about shredding of documents. It's just, anyone that hears about shredding of documents, it just instantly throws up the red flags and says, illegal, this is inappropriate. And children are at risk because of that.
Yeah, because the reason why I would have been such a damning witness to the Watchtower is because the Watchtower was saying it was the Spring Grove's congregation. They mishandled this situation. The Spring Grove said they were following direction of the Watchtower. So here, my case happened the exact same time in the exact same area, and my elders did the exact same thing as Spring Grove did. And then 6 years later, when I was an elder, we were still handling things the exact same way. So it clearly showed to any jury that Watchtower had not changed their practices, that Spring Grove were obeying Watchtower right to 100% of what they were supposed to do, and yet this was going to happen every single time another incident would happen with abuse in another congregation.
And I think that's really important to highlight, actually. So what we're saying is that Watchtower told Spring Grove to act in a certain way, but then years later when it comes to trial, Watchtower saying, oh, no, the elders did that off their own accord. We never told them to do that. And essentially, Watchtower threw these elders under the bus.
Exactly.
Now, we've observed this before because this happened this has been documented in Ireland. We know there was a case in Ireland where local elders were thrown under the bus, where Watchtower told them not to report. Then Watchtower later said, oh, we never told you not to report. And the elders were saying, no, you told us not to do this. And Watchtower was saying, no, listen very carefully. We never told you, essentially changing their tune.
Yeah.
So I think it's vital for elders to realize if you're an elder and if you're listening to this, if you are presented with a case of child abuse, if things go wrong and the law gets involved and it looks like you might be liable, do not expect Watchtower to protect you or come to your aid. They will throw you under the bus in order to make sure that the larger corporation isn't held legally liable, which is despicable because that means they don't even have the guts to stand up for for their own process. But I think that's vital for elders to understand. You cannot rely on Watchtower to help you. If you follow orders, Watchtower will throw you under the bus if those orders go wrong.
A sobering way to conclude our episode, gentlemen. But wow, what an incredible discussion. And I'm sure there's so much more we could go into. But again, I can only thank you, Martin, for coming on and sharing your story. And I hope we'll have you on another episode in the future.
Looking forward to it.
Okay, brilliant. Well, all that remains is for me to thank my co-hosts, John Redwood and Covert Fade, for, again, what has just been jaw-dropping in terms of getting to grips with all the intricacies of Watchtower's mishandling of child sex abuse. We will do our best on Watchtower in Focus to keep a tab on this situation as it develops and as more cases come to light. But for now, if you have enjoyed this video, please don't forget to subscribe, and as always, thank you for watching.